So the United Nations Human Rights Representative for Afghanistan released a report today that shows a new high level of human rights violation by the Taliban in many levels. They torture women, human rights activists, and so on and so forth. So may I ask you which kind of action the United States would take to keep the Taliban accountable? So far, we have seen that the Taliban asked many things from the United States, and they got it, many of them. They got money, and also they are flexible, some sort of, but they haven't given anything so far, especially the United States asked for, including women's rights. They banned women from universities, and they are torturing journalists and human rights activists. So people are asking this question, that which kind of action the United States would take to keep them accountable.
Sure. I just want to be very clear on the premise of your question. It is certainly not the case that we have provided the Taliban with any support whatsoever. And in fact, we have gone to great lengths to continue to be the world's leading humanitarian provider to the people of Afghanistan in a way that doesn't flow through the coffers of the Taliban. We've provided about $1.1 billion worth of humanitarian assistance to the Afghan people, not to the Taliban, not to any entity purporting to represent or to serve as the government of Afghanistan for that very reason. When it comes to the trust fund that we established a trust fund so that this funding would not be able to be diverted to the Taliban and to use for their own ends. The trust fund, the $3.5 billion in the so-called Afghan fund that we established, is for broader macroeconomic stability, again, for the people of Afghanistan, but certainly not to support the Taliban in any way. Much to the contrary, we've been reviewing our approach and engagement with the Taliban in the context of many of the human rights violations, the draconian edicts, the repugnant actions that we've seen from the Taliban in recent weeks and in recent months. I'm just not in a position to detail where we are in that process, but I can tell you we are actively evaluating with allies and partners the appropriate next steps. We've been clear that there will be costs for the Taliban for these actions. Absolutely everything remains on the table, and we're looking at a range of options that will allow us to maintain our position as principal position as the single largest donor of humanitarian assistance in Afghanistan. Again, that's funding that goes directly to the Afghan people, while also doing everything we can to prevent the humanitarian situation from deteriorating even further. These responses take some time. They involve significant coordination with our allies, with international partners, and Afghan women themselves. We have been in touch with senior UN officials as well. There have been delegations from the UN to Afghanistan to investigate the situation and to be a constructive force vis-a-vis what we've seen from the Taliban. But the humanitarian and the human rights communities, there's no question, are facing extremely difficult options as they strive to help those in dire need, while also remaining neutral, impartial, and independent in their provision of support to the Afghan people. Because as a result of these edicts, men are not allowed to enter women-headed households. NGOs cannot reach most of the most vulnerable inside of Afghanistan, including in women-run households and mothers who must maintain adequate nutrition for their newborn babies without female workers present. As of earlier this month, about 83% of organizations operating in Afghanistan had suspended or reduced their operations because they came to the conclusion that they could not do their work under these new edicts. This is unacceptable to us, but more importantly to the international community, because it imperils some 28 million Afghans who need this humanitarian assistance to survive, and especially women and children, those who are especially vulnerable. So we're firmly committed to helping alleviate the suffering of the Afghan people. And as I mentioned before, we've been the world's leading humanitarian provider, $1.1 billion in assistance since August of 2021 to provide critical aid. And I have no doubt that we'll continue to do everything we can to support the weighty humanitarian needs of the Afghan people.
Yeah, the concern is that the Taliban are getting that money because there is no any clear strategy to give that money to ordinary people and vulnerable people. So the concern is, and there are reports that Taliban are obviously using that money for their own benefits.
This money is not flowing to or through the Taliban. It is being administered by NGO partners on the ground, or I should say it has been administered by NGO partners on the ground. And I say has because of the challenge we're facing now. These draconian edicts on the part of the Taliban, including an edict propagated on Christmas Eve of last year, that NGOs couldn't work with women, had to work with men. Of course, that is an unsustainable obligation, restriction on the part of many international NGOs. And we've seen many international NGOs come to the conclusion that they're just not in a position to continue providing this aid to the Afghan people. We're going to do what we can to see to it that these edicts are reversed using the leverage that we have to seek to accomplish that. But also to do everything we can to continue to provide humanitarian assistance to the Afghan people in the context of these restrictions and edicts.